On yet? Oh, oh.
Okay, on the next video, we're going to continue where we left off from previous video. Quick review. What we did on the previous video, we checked the occlusion, we checked the incisal guidance angle, we checked the condylar setting. We then checked to see that the articulation was in centric occlusion. Then we took the textbook. We checked to make sure that we understand where we're working. Remember, you have to know the end result before you start. You can't just start and hope something happens. You have to know where you're going before you even start the process. So, first thing we did, we took the red pencil, we marked the buccal finishing line, we marked the lingual finishing line. Then with the red pencil, we marked where we think the cusp tips will go, according to the textbook. Then we took some white wax. We put a very thin film of white wax from the buccal preparation area to the lingual, to the mesial, to the distal. Now we're ready to start the process. So if we look at the textbook on page 50 and 51, we'll see that they've given you approximate alignments. So you know on the mandibular first molar, there are 3 cusps on the buccal side, there are 2 on the lingual side. So we're going to take an attempt at that and see how it works out. And if you look at the opposing, it'll show you, if you look carefully, you see small bullseyes, so it'll show you exactly where those cusps are lining. So at this point, we're not building a cusp, but we're building an orientation just to see how it aligns in centric occlusion. So the first thing I'm going to do is take a little bit of white wax, take a drop of white wax. This will only be about 1 millimeter high, and I'm going to add it to the buccal tip. I'll be doing this in laboratory class, so you'll be able to see it much closer, but it'll be posted on Blackboard so you can review it. So at this point, all I'm doing is adding slightly to the buccal cusp tips, and at this point, you know that the buccal cusp tips in centric occlusion occlude somewhere down the central fossa of the opposing teeth, the maxillary posterior teeth. So these are no more than about 1 millimeter high. They're slightly cone-shaped, and when you look at the textbook, you'll see it carefully in the textbook. So what I've done is I've added the buccal cusp tips. I'm closing down the articulation, and let me mark this so you can see it better. If you look at the textbook again, you'll see that the mesial triangular fossa, central triangular fossa, distal triangular fossa. So to make it easier to see, let's mark it on the model. Mesial, 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 central, distal, mesial, central. So those blue marks are corresponding to the textbook. At this point, I should be able to close it in centric occlusion, and it should be just touching. Not even touching. There should be a tiny space. So I've added a tip. Here's the fossa. It should be coming in. It should not be touching yet, but it should be pointing in that direction. So in centric occlusion, it's pointing. When I move in a lateral movement, it'll slide out buccally or lingually. And when I move mesial or distal, so there should be no contact. So if I unlock the articulator, look at the first cusp, the buccal cusp at a lower first premolar. When I close it down, it should be pointing at that blue dot. At that point, I should be able to move it slightly into a working movement. It should hit nothing. I should then move it into a lateral, into a balancing movement, nothing. And when I move forward with the cuspid rise, as you know in mutually protected occlusion, when I move the mandible forward, and it discloses, and if you notice the posterior teeth, even the molars, the 2 last molars, it comes out of occlusion. So if you remember, mutually protected occlusion means the posterior protects the anterior protects the posterior. So as a patient protrudes and the anterior, the centrals and laterals and cuspids slide over each other, you notice the posterior lifts up. So if that's all working out, then you know you have it in the right place. So now I can continue, and let's continue with this. I can continue to add, but again, it's only going to be about 1 millimeter high. And again, it's not touching the opposing, it's just pointing at the opposing. And if it breaks off, don't get upset, you just put it in the wrong place. move it slightly. So if a tip should break away, that means you're not in the correct spot for centric occlusion. You should be able to move it slightly medially or distally, then check the occlusion again. So at that point, we have these 5 cusps in place. They're pointing at the blue dots. I know I'm okay. So now I can move on to the lingual cusps. On the lingual cusps in class 1 centric occlusion, there is no contact. So what I'm doing is, at this point, I'm just doing it by eye, looking at the master model, and make sure you keep the master model right in front of you. You won't have that in a laboratory, but you'll have it in school until you learn how to do this correctly. So remember, on the lingual cusps, there on the first premolar, there is 1 lingual cusp. On the second premolar, there are 2 lingual cusps. On the molar, there are 2 lingual cusps. So again, at this point, all I'm doing is adding orientation points. Once the orientation points, and you're going to do the same thing on both sides. So I'm only going to do one side, so we're not wasting time here, but we'll duplicate our efforts on the other side. And I'm just about done. Once we have that, then we're going to move on to the next color. And it doesn't make a difference if you're doing one tooth, or if you're doing the entire mouth. It's the same process, and in the beginning it's relatively slow, but once you get the hang of it, this is going to move faster and faster. So now, I can, even the lingual cusps, even though they're not in occlusion, and they're in lingually, so they're not touching anything in centric occlusion, when I close down the articulator, I should be able to move it sideways, working and balancing, and it should not hit anything, which it did not. So at least I know they're in the right place. If I put them in the wrong place, so let's use my models here. If I have the maxillary mandibular, and right now I'm in class 1, so class 1 occlusion is the mesial-lingual cusp tip of the maxillary first molar occludes with the central fossa of the lower first molar, or the mesial-buccal cusp tip of the upper first molar is directly in line with the buccal groove of the lower first molar. I know it sounds like a mouthful, but eventually you'll learn this. So we've already done the buccal tips. You can see that the buccal tips fit into the central fossa, but if we turn around and we look at it lingually, the lingual cusp tips are not touching anything in centric occlusion. But as soon as we move it into a working movement, ultimately this is what we're going to have by the end. We're going to have lingual touching lingual, and we'll have buccal touching buccal. So that here, that's a working movement. And on the opposite side, I have lingual touching buccal, and that's a balancing movement. I think you know that from first semester, but we'll go over it again in lecture. So centric occlusion, lower buccal cusps into the central fossa. When I come into a working movement, buccals on buccal, linguals on lingual. On the opposing side, when I have lingual on the bottom, buccal on the top, that's a balancing. So let's keep going. So now we've completed this. Let's make believe we finished it on both sides. So we did the red line, buccal lingual. We put a film of hot white wax, both sides. We put the little cone, the tips, red wax, so we know where it is. We added the white wax. We checked the cones to make sure they're in the correct place in all different directions. So now it's time to start actually building the tooth. So what we are going to do, if I'm going to, let me try it on this one. We've already done a tip, but what we're going to do is we're going to divide the tooth into pieces, and I'm not going to do the entire buccal, but I'll just do the mesial inclination of the buccal cusp. So that one piece that I'm coloring in, I don't know if you can see it, but I'm doing it in a red pencil. We'll do it again in the lab. We're going to establish that little piece. After that's okay, then we come over to the other side. So we're breaking the tooth down into all small little portions. And if we go back to the book, each spot has a contact. If you notice on all these teeth, I've marked them in black so you can see where all the various contact points are, but we're going to learn them one at a time. So if we've already done the tips, now it's time to start establishing the actual cusp. So instead of doing the entire thing at one time, hoping for the best, we already have the tip done. We're going to do the mesial inclination of the buccal cusp. After that's done, we're going to do the distal inclination. Over here, mesial, distal, mesial, distal, mesial, distal, and on the lingual. So if you look at the picture, you can see there's a contact. So as we start building, we'll keep building until that contact is established. Then we know we're there, we can stop. We can go to the next one and do all the mesial inclinations. Once we have that done, we come over to the other half of the tooth. We do the distal inclination. We make sure we have the contact. Ultimately, we'll go through every single one of these contacts. We'll have the entire buccal surface done. We'll do the lingual side. Then ultimately, we move on to the triangular ridges, establish those contacts. Then we'll go on to the lingual cusp. We'll establish those contacts. Then we'll double back and we'll check that we have every single contact in the correct place. We'll make sure that it occludes correctly. Double check. This is actually project number 3. And we're going to be talking about the Thomas notch. The Thomas notch is a slight depression that's on mandibular premolars, distal inclination of the buccal cusp, and it only occurs in a lateral movement. So that little chip that you see on the lower tooth, you can only establish it if you move the articulator in a lateral movement. Developed by Dr. Peter K. Thomas. We talked about him already, but we'll keep going over it. So let's try. So now we're ready to start building up. And you probably don't even need separator, but if you want a little separator, you can put some on the top if you don't feel comfortable doing it without separator. But if you do this correctly, you won't need separator. So let's start off. Again, look at your master model before you even start. Again, I'm just building one piece. The first one's going to be difficult. If you don't like it, just take it off. Don't keep working with it if it's something you don't like. You notice the mesial inclination of the buccal cusp is slightly convex. So make sure as you wax it accordingly. You drew a red line, so you should be able to see where to stop. If the doctor's giving you that finishing line, it's not for you to change it. You'll stop exactly where the doctor established it. Take a little small amounts at a time. The trick of Peter K. Thomas waxing is that you do not have to change anything. You don't have to redo anything. You don't have to carve anything. And if you do it correctly the first time, then there's nothing to fix. There's no carving required. You can put the wax exactly where it goes. And we're going to check every little drop that we add. We will check it in all the various movements. So once this is established, and I think I have it in the correct place, I'm going to close it in centric occlusion first to make sure I have that contact point that I just saw in the book. Then I will move it in working, balancing, protrusion, and retraction. And if everything stays, then we have it. So let's just smooth it off slightly. I'm just visually looking at it. I think I'm there. Let me close it down slightly. Okay, it's just touching on the same place. So let's bring the textbook back. Let's bring the textbook back to page 52. 52. So just as a reminder, the contact was not on the tip of the cusp. You should have seen that by now. It's on slightly off to the tip. There's a contact on the mesial inclination. There's a contact on the distal inclination. So that little piece that I just established is the mesial inclination of the buccal cusp at a lower premolar. So before it gets hard, I'm going to close it down in centric occlusion. I see no spaces. I now move it into working movement. I move it into balancing. I move it into protrusion and retraction. And I know it's hard to see in a video, but you'll see it in class that it's touching. I'm in working. It's touching in balancing. I'm now using both thumbs to move the articulator straight back. The tips are touching. So it's working, balancing, protrusion, retraction, and centric occlusion. I have that half a cusp done. At that point, I can go into the second one. So I'll do one, and then we can slowly move on as it's established and we get the hang of it. They'll go faster and faster, each one. So now I come over to the distal inclination. I can come over to the next page, and there is contact. And you should be looking for it, because don't try to put contact where it doesn't exist. If it's not in nature, it's not up to you to change it. So I've built up now the distal inclination. I'm coming right down to the red line, the doctor's preparation point. blend the two in together, close the articulator while it's still soft, and I can just see the beginning of the Thomas notch. We just talked about it. It's a small depression. It's on the distal inclination of the buccal cusp of the lower premolars. So when I close it down, the upper cusp on the upper premolar is hitting, and I have to do this quickly or it'll break off. So close it in centric occlusion, move it into working and balancing, protrusion, retraction, and if you look very carefully, you'll see that there is a slight concavity. Let's see if I can find it in here, and we'll show you better pictures so you'll understand it. Hold on, hold on, hold on. Almost, here it is. So if we look very carefully, the distal inclination of the buccal cusp of the lower premolars, you can see it here marked in sort of a grayish black color, and it's only when you move the articulator in lateral movement. If you move it only in centric occlusion, you're not going to establish that area, and then if I move it, or if the patient moves their mouth, the two teeth will fracture. So you have to make sure you move it correctly. So now, we have, at this point, we have the buccal cusp done. There's really no carving. I can smooth it off lightly if I want, make it a little neater, but that one cusp is finished. Next step will be to move on to the next one, do the exact same thing. Then the next thing is to go to the molar. I'll do the mesial inclination, then the distal, then the mesial, then the distal, then the mesial, then the distal. I'll have the whole buccal side done. Then I'll swing around to the lingual side. I'll build up the lingual cusp, the two lingual cusps, the two large lingual cusps on the molar, very large cusps. Once that's done, then we'll continue with the next video. So let's take an attempt at it, let's take a shot at it and see if you can do it. Again, if you don't like it, knock it off. It's not worth trying to fix it. It only took a minute or two. Just flick it away, redo it again, but let's follow the procedure. Once you get the hang of it, it's going to move very fast. Okay, so that's it for this video. Good luck.